A white businessman refuses to sit next to a young black girl, spewing arrogance that grips the entire cabin. Passengers watch in silence. The flight crew freezes, and the girl's calm dignity contrasts sharply with his entitled rage. A subtle gesture at the end reveals she carries a hidden identity that will shake everyone on board. "We don't sit with people like you." The line didn't just hang in the air, it ripped through it. Passengers gasped, seatbelts clicked as people turned their heads, and the hum of the engines seemed to dim. The venom in the man's voice echoed across the business-class cabin. The man who spoke stood tall, shoulders stiff in a tailored gray suit. His tie was loosened as though his comfort mattered more than the rules of decency. His face, flushed with anger, bent downward toward the young black girl seated by the window. She didn't flinch. She sat with her back straight, her braids neatly tied, a slim leather-bound notebook resting on her lap. One hand tapped gently against its cover, each beat steady as if she had all the time in the world. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was unsettling control. Around them, passengers whispered in hushed tones. Did he just say that? Unbelievable. Eyes darted, searching for someone to intervene, but no one stepped in. They were spectators to a theater of humiliation, some angry, others curious, all too silent. The flight attendant, caught like a deer in headlights, approached nervously. "Sir," she said, voice trembling, "all seats are assigned. You'll have to remain where you are." The man's jaw clenched. He snapped his fingers in her face. "Move me now or move her. I am not flying like this." The girl's eyes lifted slowly. Calm, unhurried. Her gaze was neither defensive nor submissive. It was piercing, like glass cutting into stone. She looked at him as if she saw right through the layers of ego he wore like armor. The attendant hesitated, stammering. "Sir, there are no other available seats." The man slammed his palm against the armrest. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. "Do you know who I am?" His arrogance filled the space. Passengers held their breath, some shrinking back, others brimming with outrage. A mother pulled her child closer. A man in the row behind clenched his jaw but said nothing. Finally, the girl spoke. Her voice was soft, yet it carried through the cabin with the clarity of thunder. "Your choice of seat won't change the direction of the sky." A ripple moved through the passengers. Some stifled laughter, others widened their eyes. The businessman froze as though struck by something he couldn't immediately counter. "What did you just say to me?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his certainty. She closed her notebook with deliberate grace, the leather strap snapping shut like a gavel in a courtroom. Her expression remained calm, but her words sharpened. "Sometimes, one empty seat changes the entire course of the world." The silence that followed was heavier than the insult he had thrown at her minutes ago. Even the engines seemed to quiet as the plane began to taxi. The man faltered, searching for a retort. His arrogance, once towering, now trembled under the weight of her calm. For the first time, the audience, the silent passengers, weren't just judging him. They were questioning who she was. The plane lurched forward. The captain's voice announced takeoff, but no one heard it. Their attention remained chained to the confrontation in row 4. As the aircraft ascended into the orange sky, the girl reached calmly into her purse. She pulled out a card, dark, embossed, official. For a fleeting second, the golden light hit its surface and something powerful shimmered. Before anyone could fully see it, the plane jolted through turbulence. The card slipped back under her fingers, hidden once again. But the message was clear. This girl was not ordinary. Passengers exchanged looks of intrigue. The man's breathing grew uneven, his earlier dominance leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. The girl turned back to the window, unbothered. The fading sun reflected in her eyes like fire. She whispered almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. "Some storms begin with a single word." The businessman swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. For the first time, he looked small. The curtain of the story had lifted, and every soul on board sensed it. This flight would not be ordinary. The aircraft tilted upward, engines roaring as the city below shrank into a blur of lights. Yet inside the cabin, the silence was louder than the engines. Passengers leaned toward each other, voices hushed but urgent. "Did you hear what he said?" Unbelievable, in this day and age. She didn't even raise her voice. Every row buzzed with half-whispered judgments, though no one dared speak loud enough for the man to hear. The businessman, jaw set tight, sat stiff in his seat. His hands gripped the armrests, not out of fear of flying, but out of fury at the invisible judgment pressing down on him from every angle. The young black girl gazed out the window unbothered. The city lights flickered below like fading embers, but her reflection in the glass was calm, almost regal. The notebook sat closed on her lap, her fingers resting gently on it as though guarding something sacred. The flight attendant reappeared, forcing a polite smile. "Is everything comfortable now?" she asked cautiously. The man shot her a glare. "Comfortable? I had to sit here against my will. This is not how a paying customer should be treated." Her professional mask didn't falter, though her eyes betrayed unease. "Sir, once we reach cruising altitude, I'll see if there's any flexibility. For now, please fasten your belt," he huffed, sinking deeper into his seat, muttering, "Outrageous." Across the aisle, a woman in pearls leaned toward her husband. She didn't even flinch, she whispered, tilting her head toward the girl. "Did you see that? Like she's used to this." Her husband frowned. "Or maybe she knows something we don't." The girl shifted slightly, turning her head just enough to catch the woman's eyes. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. The woman blushed as though caught in a secret and quickly looked away. The man beside her, still seething, noticed. "What are you staring at?" He snapped at the girl. Her eyes met his, calm and unwavering. "At a man who mistakes noise for power." The words cut like glass. A few rows back, a passenger stifled a laugh, coughing into his hand to disguise it. The businessman's cheeks reddened. "You think you're clever, don't you?" He spat. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened her notebook slowly. The sound of the strap unfastening drew the attention of more passengers. She flipped a page, her pen gliding across it in swift, deliberate strokes. "What are you writing?" he demanded. She lifted her head just enough to meet his eyes. "The truth. And the truth always finds a way to land." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers shifted in their seats, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Some leaned closer, drawn into the silent duel playing out between arrogance and calm authority. The engines leveled into a steady hum as the plane reached cruising altitude. Lights dimmed, casting a golden glow across the cabin. Trays clinked, seatbelts unbuckled, but no one's attention strayed from row 4. The businessman pulled at his tie, sweat gathering at his temple. He reached for the call button, pressing it with unnecessary force. The ding echoed overhead. The same flight attendant approached, cautious but composed. "Yes, sir? I demand an upgrade. Get me away from her." Her voice was soft, but her words carried the weight of finality. "Sir, there is no higher upgrade than the seat you are already in." The girl closed her notebook again, lips curving into the faintest smile. "Perhaps he's afraid of flying too close to the truth." A murmur spread through the passengers. Some hid their grins behind hands, others exchanged knowing looks. The man squirmed, his authority dissolving like ice under fire. He leaned toward her, voice low but venomous. "Who do you think you are?" The question hung between them like a dare. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her purse once more. Fingers brushed against the same embossed card from before. This time she let it slip halfway into the light, just enough for the golden emblem to glint before she tucked it away again. Her eyes lifted to his, calm and deliberate. "You'll find out soon enough." The businessman froze. Something in her tone, not loud, not boastful, but certain, made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned away, jaw tight, staring at the seat in front of him as if it held the answers. The whispers swelled again, passengers trading guesses like gamblers at a table. Who was she? Why was she so calm? And what was on that card? The flight, meant to be ordinary, had become a stage. And everyone knew. The performance was far from over. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, mimicking sunset though it was only evening below. Flight attendants moved quietly down the aisles, trays in hand, offering drinks. The hum of the engines became a steady background rhythm, soothing for some, agitating for others. The businessman in seat 4A was among the agitated. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, leg bouncing with nervous energy. Every now and then he glanced sideways at the girl in 4B, as though her very presence was an offense to him. She sat serene, her eyes closed, earbuds tucked in, notebook resting lightly on her lap. To anyone watching, she looked like she was lost in thought, or perhaps in prayer. The man leaned toward her suddenly, breaking the fragile calm. You think ignoring me makes you better than me? His voice carried, too loud for comfort. Several heads turned. A mother hushed her child, pulling him closer. A college student 3 rows back pulled out his phone, subtly pressing record. The girl opened her eyes slowly, pulling out one earbud. I think ignoring you keeps the peace, she said evenly. Peace? He scoffed. You're sitting in first class because of quotas, aren't you? Handouts. That's the only way you people ever get ahead. Gasps rippled across the cabin. One passenger muttered, unbelievable. Another whispered, he said that out loud? The girl's gaze didn't waver. Careful, she said softly. Sometimes the words you throw come back like boomerangs. He laughed sharply, though the sound lacked conviction. What's that supposed to mean? You threatening me? Before she could reply, a man across the aisle leaned in. His salt and pepper hair and tailored suit suggested success, but his tone carried no arrogance, only warning. Sir, maybe you should stop. Everyone's watching. The businessman turned his scorn toward the stranger. Mind your business. This is between me and her. No, a younger woman piped up from behind. Her voice shook but carried courage. It's between all of us now. We don't have to sit here and listen to you spew hate. The businessman twisted in his seat, glaring at the passengers. Oh, so you're all against me now, typical. You defend her because it's fashionable. The murmurs swelled. Someone muttered, about time someone called him out. Another whispered, she hasn't raised her voice once. Through it all, the girl remained calm, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. She looked at the man, and for the first time her voice carried steel beneath the calm. You mistake silence for weakness. But silence is often the preparation before truth speaks. The businessman leaned back, scoffing. Truth, don't make me laugh. You wouldn't know truth if it slapped you in the face. The girl leaned closer, her eyes locking onto his. For a heartbeat, the cabin seemed to shrink until only they existed in that charged space. Truth doesn't slap, she said. It unmasks. The words sent a ripple through the air like a sudden chill. A passenger near the front shifted uncomfortably. The man with the phone recording whispered, she's not just anyone. She knows something. The businessman rolled his eyes, but there was unease in his posture now. He loosened his tie, his breath shallow. You're full of riddles, she smiled faintly. No, just patience. The seatbelt sign dinged above, the captain's voice coming through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. Enjoy your flight. The announcement only seemed to highlight the thin air of tension still hanging in the cabin. The businessman crossed his arms, staring straight ahead. His lips moved in a low growl only she could hear. Mark my words, before this flight lands, everyone will know who's in charge. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered just loud enough for him and for the nearest passengers to hear. Yes, everyone will know. Her hand brushed against her purse again, and a glint of gold caught the dim cabin light. The emblem flashed briefly, disappearing just as quickly. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Whispers intensified. Did you see that? What was it? She's somebody important. The businessman noticed too. His jaw tightened, but instead of pressing further, he sank deeper into his seat. The arrogance was still there, but beneath it something new stirred. Fear. The girl leaned back, earbuds sliding in again as if the conversation was over. To her it was. To him, it was only beginning. The plane surged forward through the night sky, but inside the cabin the divide had already been drawn. Half of the passengers sat in quiet solidarity with the girl. The other half watched in silence, unsure but uneasy. And in row 4, arrogance and truth sat side by side, hurtling toward an inevitable collision. The plane soared steady, cruising high above storm clouds. From the window seats, the horizon was painted in shades of deep violet and silver, moonlight cutting across the endless night. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was far from calm. The businessman adjusted his cufflinks, his every motion tight with suppressed irritation. His jaw clenched, his eyes bloodshot, his pride wounded in ways he couldn't quite understand. Around him, whispers lingered like smoke, unsettling, inescapable. She's someone important. Did you see that emblem? Maybe she's government. The girl sat quiet again, but it wasn't silence this time. It was gravity. Her presence weighed heavier with each passing minute, pulling the room into her orbit. The businessman finally broke the hush. You think you've got these people fooled? His voice dripped with venom, pitched just loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. You're nothing. A seat warmer. A charity case. The girl looked up, her eyes calm pools reflecting cabin light. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her lack of response made him unravel faster. What, too proud to answer me now? Hiding behind your silence. Typical. From across the aisle, the salt-and-pepper-haired passenger spoke again, voice firm. Enough, we're tired of your abuse, the businessman sneered. And what are you? Her bodyguard? Or just another sympathizer looking for applause? The man didn't flinch. No, just someone who knows when the truth is about to walk through the door. The businessman froze for a second, unsettled. He scanned the cabin, faces staring at him, phones discreetly pointed in his direction. He had become a spectacle, the villain of a play he didn't audition for. Still, he clung to arrogance. You're all sheep. You see what you want to see. He turned to the girl, spitting the words. Go on then. Tell them who you are. Prove me wrong. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Not yet. The two words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Not yet. Passengers exchanged looks. One whispered, she's waiting for something. Another murmured, she's too calm. Way too calm. The businessman leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You're bluffing. I've met people like you, always pretending to be more than you are. She tilted her head, her eyes never breaking from his. And I've met people like you, always smaller than they think they are. The blow wasn't in volume, but in precision. His face flushed. He gripped the armrest, knuckles white. Suddenly, a turbulence jolt rocked the cabin. The plane dipped, a collective gasp filling the air. Drinks spilled. Seatbelts clinked as passengers tightened them. For a few moments, all arrogance vanished. Fear was the great equalizer. The girl's hand moved to steady her notebook, but in that motion, the golden emblem slipped again into view. A flash, a seal. This time a flight attendant caught it, her eyes widening. She paused mid-step, tray trembling slightly in her hands. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but she held herself back. She looked at the girl, then looked away quickly, her posture shifting from casual to respectful. The businessman noticed. His heart skipped. He saw the subtle bow in the attendant's shoulders, the way her tone changed when she said softly, Ma'am, can I get you anything? Ma'am, not miss. Not casual. Ma'am, with weight. The girl simply shook her head. No, thank you. The businessman's chest tightened. He glanced at the attendant, then back at the girl. What was that? Why did she? He cut himself off, realizing the question exposed his fear. The girl leaned closer, her voice like velvet over steel. You wanted truth? You'll get it, but not on your time. On mine. Her words landed with finality, a gavel hitting the bench. She leaned back, returning to her quiet as if nothing had happened. The businessman sat frozen, replaying the interaction in his mind. His arrogance still clung to him, but it was trembling now, its foundation cracking. Around the cabin, passengers whispered louder, no longer afraid to speculate. She has power. She's connected. She's not who we thought she was. And still, the businessman tried to convince himself he had control. He adjusted his cufflinks again, straightened his tie, but his hands trembled ever so slightly. The girl closed her eyes once more, serene as a saint, calm as the storm before lightning. The flight pushed forward into the endless sky. But everyone in first class knew something was coming, something that would turn arrogance into ashes. The cabin was quieter now, but it wasn't peace, it was the stillness of people waiting for something to break. The engines hummed steady, but underneath that steady rhythm was tension coiled tight as wire. The businessman shifted in his seat, straightening his posture. He forced his chest out, trying to reclaim authority through body language. His voice, when it finally cut the silence, was loud and sharp. Don't think for a second that I'm intimidated. You're nothing but a girl in the wrong seat. The words sliced through the cabin, but instead of agreement, there was resistance. A mother 2 rows back frowned deeply, pulling her child closer as though to shield him from the poison of the words. The student with the phone muttered into his recording, "This is what hate looks like." The girl remained still, her face unreadable. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting his ugliness back at him. The businessman slammed his hand against the armrest. Say something. Defend yourself if you're so important. She finally opened her eyes, gaze steady as a mountain. I don't defend myself against lies. Truth doesn't beg. Gasps fluttered through the cabin. Some passengers even nodded, their faces lighting with recognition of her strength. The businessman scoffed, though his voice cracked under the weight of their reaction. Oh, so now you're some kind of philosopher? Sitting there, pretending you're above it all? Don't make me laugh. A passenger across the aisle leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. Sir, you're embarrassing yourself. The businessman's face reddened. He turned his anger on the stranger. Shut up, you don't know who I am. Neither do we care, the man shot back. But we're starting to learn who she is. And that's what scares you, isn't it? The businessman faltered. For the briefest moment, his eyes flickered with doubt. Then, like a drowning man clutching at straws, he lashed out again. She's playing you all, waving little symbols around, making you believe she's important. It's a trick. All of it, but his words no longer rang with conviction. They sounded desperate, brittle, hollow. The girl tilted her head, voice soft but carrying across the cabin. You want me small? You need me small. Because if I'm not, then what does that make you? The line hit like a thunderclap. Some passengers clapped softly, breaking the unwritten rule of airplane etiquette. The sound was small but powerful, a ripple of solidarity. The businessman's jaw clenched, his hands shaking. He grabbed his glass of water, lifted it as though to drink. Then, perhaps fueled by rage, perhaps by the need to reclaim dominance, he flicked the contents toward her. A collective gasp erupted. Water sprayed, catching the dim cabin light, landing on her notebook and sleeve. The girl didn't flinch. She simply reached for a napkin, blotting the page calmly, almost tenderly. Then she looked at him, not with anger, but with pity. Is that all? She asked. The businessman's face drained of color. What was meant as humiliation became his own undoing. The passengers erupted, some shouting, some filming, others calling for flight attendants. The salt-and-pepper-haired man shook his head, muttering loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. A man who can't control his hand has already lost the fight. The businessman stammered. She provoked me. You all saw— No, a woman interrupted. We saw you. The flight attendant hurried down the aisle, face tight with both urgency and restraint. She crouched by the girl. Ma'am, are you all right? Perfectly, the girl replied, dabbing the last of the water from her page. Her composure was untouched, unshaken. The attendant turned to the businessman, her voice low and clipped. Sir, one more outburst like that and the captain will be notified. Do you understand? The businessman barked a bitter laugh. Notify whoever you want. I'm not the one who should be worried. But his voice had lost its edge. His words were no longer sharp blades. They were dull echoes, bouncing back to expose his weakness. The girl closed her notebook gently, as though sealing something away. Then she whispered, not to him, but to the air itself, words that everyone could hear. Respect is not begged for. It's revealed. And soon it will be. The cabin felt charged, like the heavy silence before lightning splits the sky. The passengers leaned into her words, drawn by the weight of them. The businessman sat back, trembling with rage, but also with fear. His armor of arrogance was cracking piece by piece, and there was no patch left strong enough to mend it. And all the while, the girl waited, calm, patient, certain, because truth, once revealed, would need no defense. The plane pushed steadily through the night sky, its engines a steady roar above the turbulence of human tension inside. The first-class cabin, once hushed with luxury, now throbbed with whispers and judgmental stares. The businessman was no longer the confident figure he had been at boarding. He looked smaller, tighter, as though the very seat that once symbolized privilege now pressed down on him like a cage. He tugged at his tie, his breath uneven. Every time he glanced around, he found phones pointed toward him, passengers' eyes sharp with condemnation. You're all sheep, he snapped suddenly, his voice cracking. She's got you hypnotized. You don't even know who she is. The girl, still poised, finally looked up from her dampened notebook. Her eyes shimmered with patience, with strength that seemed unshakable. Neither do you, she said simply. The words stung deeper than any insult. The businessman swallowed hard, his throat dry. For the first time, silence clung to him, and it was not chosen. It was imposed. From across the cabin, the mother with her child spoke, her voice steady now. I don't need to know who she is. I can already see who she isn't. The businessman glared. What's that supposed to mean? She isn't cruel. She isn't hateful. She isn't you. Applause broke out, quiet at first, then stronger. A ripple of solidarity moved through the cabin like a wave. Passengers exchanged nods, some raising their glasses in silent salute toward the girl. The businessman's face flushed crimson. "So you're all against me, over her? You don't even know what she is." The salt-and-pepper-haired man leaned forward again, his voice deep, steady. "That's exactly why we believe her. Because power doesn't need to shout. It sits and it waits, and when it speaks—" He paused, looking directly at the girl. "It changes everything." The businessman slammed his fist against the armrest. "Enough of this nonsense. She's nobody. Just say it. Say what you are." The girl's lips curved into a faint smile, and she leaned in close enough for only him and the nearest passengers to hear. "Patience, Mr. Randall," his name, spoken like a blade slicing through the air. The businessman's face went pale. He hadn't introduced himself. Not once. Passengers leaned forward, sensing the shift.
"She knows him?"
One whispered. "How does she know his name?" Another murmured. The businessman sputtered. You must have read it somewhere." She cut him off gently, her voice calm but laced with power. "I know more than your name." A shudder of unease rippled through him. He gripped the armrest tighter, his knuckles stark white. Who are you?" Her silence in response was louder than any answer. She leaned back, closing her eyes again as though his question wasn't worth her energy. The businessman shook his head violently, trying to reclaim some semblance of dominance. "You're bluffing. All of this, an act. You can't scare me." But his words betrayed him, they trembled. Meanwhile, the whispers among the passengers grew louder, bolder. "She's connected to something big." She knew his name without him saying it. She's not just anyone. Even the flight attendants moved differently around her now. Their tones softer, their gestures more deferential. One discreetly asked if she needed a towel or another drink. She declined with a polite nod, but the air was clear. They respected her, feared her even. The businessman noticed. His breaths grew shallow. His arrogance had not vanished, but it had eroded into something fragile, like glass that looked solid but would shatter at the slightest pressure. He tried once more, his voice louder, desperate. "Fine, if you're so important, prove it. Tell us all who you are." The girl opened her eyes, looked at him, then glanced around the cabin at the sea of expectant faces. A smirk tugged at her lips, but she spoke with restraint. "Not yet," she said again. The two words struck harder than any revelation. They weren't weakness. They weren't delay. They were power, because if a truth could afford to wait, it meant it was unstoppable. The businessman sank back into his seat, sweat glistening on his forehead. His armor of arrogance had cracked beyond repair, leaving him exposed for the first time. And as the plane cut through the endless dark sky, every passenger in first class leaned closer to the silence, not fearing it anymore, but waiting for it to explode. The silence was louder than any insult. Every cough, every creak of the plane's shifting frame seemed like a scream in the absence of words. The cabin was caught in a suspended moment. No one dared breathe too loud, no one dared look too long. And yet everyone felt the undeniable truth vibrating in their bones. She had spoken, and with a single line she had ripped the veil of ignorance from every face staring at her. The man who had once puffed himself up with arrogance now sat hunched, as if gravity itself had tripled its pull on his shoulders. His jaw twitched, his knuckles were white, his throat worked in silence like he wanted to speak but couldn't. Not anymore. A child 2 rows behind whispered, too innocent to censor himself. "Daddy, and why is everyone staring at her?" The father, a balding man in a business suit, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and avoided answering. His eyes darted nervously to the girl, then away again. For the first time in his carefully controlled adult life, he looked ashamed. Shame. It was contagious now. One passenger after another looked down at their laps, phones or the untouched meal trays in front of them. The flight attendants shifted uncomfortably, their forced professional smiles cracked under the weight of complicity. The air had turned heavy, suffocating, thick with unspoken guilt. The girl sat still, her chin lifted, her breathing calm. She did not need to move, did not need to raise her voice. She had already spoken the only truth that mattered. The truth lived in her now, glowing like a quiet fire, and it was enough. The man beside her finally broke the silence, his voice rasping, stripped of its earlier arrogance. You could have said something sooner." She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his, unflinching. And you could have treated me like a human being from the start. The words were not loud, not sharp, but they cut deeper than any insult he had hurled before. His lips parted, but no sound came. He had no defense, no shield, no power left to wield. The passengers felt the shift, a subtle collapse of the mighty. Some averted their eyes again, others leaned in, unwilling to miss a second of the unraveling. The silence stretched. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy. It pressed against every chest, demanding to be felt. Finally, one of the flight attendants, the same woman who had earlier tried to manage the situation with weak platitudes, stepped closer. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" It wasn't just an offer of service. It was an apology in disguise, a desperate attempt to realign herself with dignity, to distance herself from the man who had poisoned the air with his hatred. The girl shook her head gently. "I don't need anything." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the rows of bowed heads. "But I hope all of you remember this moment. Remember how easy it was to stay silent." The words slid into the ears of every passenger, sticky and undeniable. They would replay later, in hotel rooms, in quiet car rides home, in restless dreams. Each of them would wrestle with the question, why didn't I say something? The man beside her fidgeted, his fingers tugging at his sleeve, his voice suddenly small. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" She didn't answer right away. The pause itself was powerful, the kind of pause that made people lean in without realizing it. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, steady, like a teacher correcting a child. "No, but I know I am not less than you." The silence roared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't heavy with guilt. It was filled with respect, awe, even quiet admiration. The girl leaned back in her seat, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She didn't need to fight. The fight was already won. And as the engines hummed beneath them, carrying the plane through the endless sky, the silence broke into something new. Not noise, not chatter, but awareness. The kind that lingers long after the moment passes, the kind that changes people. "I'm not racist." The words shot out of him like a reflex, too quick, too loud. The declaration cracked the fragile silence, but instead of saving him, it only exposed his fear. His voice carried no conviction. It wavered, stumbled, betrayed him. The girl didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, her gaze locked on him with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "Then why were you so afraid to sit next to me?" Her question hung in the air, delicate and devastating. The passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as though they were watching a play unfold, others sinking lower in shame. The man's throat bobbed as he searched for an answer, but his excuses betrayed him before they left his mouth. It's not like that," he stammered. "I just thought, His words tangled, collapsed, suffocated on his tongue. The girl's expression never changed. Calm, patient, as though she had heard these excuses 100 times before. She didn't need to speak. His unraveling was its own indictment. A murmur rippled through the cabin, not loud, not overt, but unmistakable. Whispers spread like cracks across glass. Passengers who had once sat frozen now turned to each other, their faces carrying the same unspoken realization. His arrogance had always been built on sand. The man's hands trembled as he reached for the call button above him, his finger hovering. But then he stopped. What could the flight attendant do? What rescue could come now? No uniform, no authority could shield him from the collapse of his own mask. The girl's voice, quiet and steady, slid into the cracks. "Your silence was comfortable until I spoke. Now your lies are choking you." Her words weren't loud, but they pierced. They were the kind of words that burrowed deep, resurfacing in the quiet hours of the night. The man looked around desperately, hoping for an ally. His eyes darted to the businessman, to the mother with the child, to the flight attendants. But no one came. The silence of the cabin was no longer his accomplice. It was her witness. Finally, he tried a different weapon. Anger. "You think you're some kind of saint? Some hero?" he spat, his voice louder now, trembling with the raw edge of desperation. "You don't know what it's like." The girl leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to carry so much hate in such a small heart." The words struck him harder than a fist. He recoiled, his lips trembling, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The fury that had once filled him now looked like fear, thinly disguised. The passengers stared wide-eyed. Some nodded subtly. Others whispered words too low to catch. One older woman pressed her hand to her lips, her eyes glistening as though she had just witnessed something she would never forget. The flight attendant appeared again, but this time, she didn't face the girl. She faced the man. Her voice was calm but edged with authority. "Sir, you need to lower your voice." For the first time, authority did not shield him, it cornered him. He leaned back, sweat glistening at his temple, his breath sharp and shallow. His power was gone. His voice, once booming, now barely reached beyond his own seat. The girl, serene, leaned back into her chair, her posture unshaken. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her victory was not in humiliating him. It was in revealing him. And that was more powerful than any insult could ever be. The passengers knew it too. Their silence was no longer passive. It had shifted into a quiet verdict. Eyes that had once turned away now bore into him with the weight of judgment. He had been tried in the court of dignity and he had lost. The engines hummed on. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane continued through the endless night sky. But for the man, there was no escape. He sat trapped in a seat that had once been his fortress, now his prison. The girl closed her eyes briefly as though offering herself a moment of peace. Her calmness, her dignity, filled the space he had emptied with shame. And as the hum of the plane carried them forward, every passenger knew. This was not just a seat on a flight. This was a mirror, and the man could no longer look away. "You don't know who I am," the man muttered, his voice sharp, desperate, clinging to the last threads of pride. The girl opened her eyes slowly, the faintest trace of patience lingering in her calm expression. "You're right," she said softly, her tone carrying a weight far heavier than his words. "But you don't know who I am either." The cabin stirred. Every ear leaned closer. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade, as though the plane itself was listening. The man swallowed, his lips parting to fire back, but nothing came. He was losing oxygen in a space where only she could breathe. The girl reached into her bag, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a sleek leather folder. She set it on her lap. For a moment, she didn't open it. She let the silence do the work. Let the tension rise, let every eye burn into the space between her and the folder. Finally, she unzipped it. A card slid out, official, embossed, carrying the weight of an office no passenger dared to question. She placed it gently on the armrest where everyone could see. Her voice was steady, unshaken. "My name," she said, pausing for just a second, "is Dr. Aaliyah Monroe, Director of Aviation Safety, Federal Government." The words detonated like a bomb in the cabin. The businessman's eyes widened. The mother clutched her child closer, not in fear but in awe. Even the flight attendant froze, her professional mask cracking for the first time. The man, pale, stared at the card, then at her. His lips parted, no sound. Just trembling disbelief. She leaned slightly closer, her gaze still calm, still steady. "The seat you refuse to share belongs to the person responsible for reviewing every airline's safety, funding, and compliance," she said. "Including this one." The air grew heavy, almost electric. Whispers erupted across the cabin like a storm breaking. Passengers turned, exchanged shocked looks, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The man's hands gripped the armrests so tight his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, a reflex, a need to defend himself. But the weight of her words crushed his voice before it could rise. The girl didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. Her tone never rose above calm, never dipped into arrogance. That restraint made her power all the more devastating. "I wasn't looking for respect," she said softly. "I was looking for humanity. You couldn't even give that." The man slumped back into his seat, his chest rising and falling as though the air around him had thinned. His arrogance, once a weapon, now lay shattered at his feet. The passenger's silence had changed. It wasn't judgment anymore. It was awe. Quiet, heavy awe. They weren't just witnesses to his downfall. They were witnesses to her rise. The flight attendant, her hands trembling slightly, bent down to her. "Dr. Monroe," she said carefully, her voice breaking the silence, Do you need us to take action?" The girl, Dr. Monroe, shook her head gently. "No," she replied. His own actions already did. The words cut sharper than any punishment could. The man covered his face with one hand, his body folding inward, as though he could hide from the truth that had just consumed him. But there was no hiding. The cabin had seen everything. The businessman exhaled heavily, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." The mother with the baby rocked her child slowly, her eyes still locked on the girl with reverence. A young student across the aisle whispered, "She's the director," with a kind of awe usually reserved for legends. Dr. Monroe leaned back, her folder still resting on her lap, her posture unshaken. Calm, dignified. She had not just revealed herself, she had revealed the emptiness of every prejudice hurled at her. The hum of the plane returned to fill the silence, but nothing was the same. The passengers weren't just flying anymore. They were carrying a story that would echo long after the landing. The man sat beside her, small, hollow, shrinking into the very seat he had once thought was too good for her. His fall was not a spectacle of violence. It was worse. It was the slow, suffocating collapse of a man who had built his identity on sand, and now the tide had washed it all away. The man hadn't moved in minutes, his shoulders slumped, his hand still shielding part of his face as if he could hide from the collective memory forming around him. But memories don't hide. They carve themselves into people's minds. The plane felt different now. The passengers were no longer just anonymous travelers. They were a silent jury, each glance a verdict, each whisper a record. Dr. Monroe sat tall, her presence filling the cabin without effort. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Dignity spoke louder than any insult, louder than his trembling denials. At last, the flight attendant returned, kneeling beside her seat. Her voice was low, reverent. "Dr. Monroe, we're so sorry for what happened." Dr. Monroe looked at her, her expression calm but firm. "You're not the one who should be apologizing," she said quietly, her eyes drifting to the man beside her. Every passenger followed her gaze. The man's breath caught. His hand fell slowly from his face, revealing eyes rimmed red, lips pressed tight as though holding back words he'd never planned to say. His arrogance had evaporated. All that remained was the hollow man beneath. He swallowed hard. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know who you were." Dr. Monroe's eyes sharpened, her tone cutting without rising. "That's the point. You shouldn't need to know." The words struck harder than any title, harder than her reveal. His head lowered, shame pouring into the empty spaces where arrogance had once lived. The cabin exhaled. The silence shifted again, this time toward her. Not in pity, not in shock, but in admiration. She had dismantled him without raising her voice, without losing her dignity. The mother with the baby leaned forward slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her words trembling with sincerity, "for showing my daughter what strength looks like." The young student across the aisle lifted his phone as if to capture the moment, but hesitated, realizing some truths didn't need to be posted to exist. They carved themselves into memory on their own. The man fumbled with his seatbelt, restless, trapped. His every twitch screamed of a man desperate to flee. But there was no escape at 30,000 feet. His prison wasn't the seat. It was himself. The businessman who had sat quietly until now finally spoke, his voice calm but weighted. "Sir," he said, looking directly at the man, "you'll remember this flight for the rest of your life. Not because of who she is, but because of who you chose to be." The words pressed the man further into collapse. He stared down at his hands, trembling, knowing every passenger agreed. Dr. Monroe inhaled deeply, her eyes drifting toward the window. The dark sky stretched endless, dotted with faint stars. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, steady, unshaken. She had carried herself through storms before, and tonight was just another page in that book. The pilot's voice broke through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be preparing for descent shortly. Please remain seated." The descent wasn't just physical. It was symbolic, a slow, inevitable return to the ground, where consequences would linger long after the wheels touched down. As the plane lowered, the man sat frozen in humiliation, his identity in ruins. Passengers avoided his eyes not out of politeness but out of verdict. He had been judged, and the sentence was isolation. Dr. Monroe closed her folder, slipping the card back into its place. She didn't need to flash it again. The truth was etched into the cabin, into every pair of eyes that had witnessed it. As the plane touched down, the jolt was sharp, final. The passengers straightened, the man flinched, and Dr. Monroe remained steady. The flight attendant made her final announcements, her eyes flickering briefly to Dr. Monroe with respect. The passengers began gathering their belongings, but their whispers weren't about baggage or connections. They were about her. The man, desperate, tried one last time. His voice broke as he leaned toward her. "Please, don't ruin me." Dr. Monroe turned her gaze to him, calm, deliberate. Her reply was soft, but it carried the weight of everything he had tried to bury. "You ruined yourself." She rose from her seat, smooth and unhurried, her dignity intact. The aisle cleared instinctively for her, passengers parting not out of fear but out of respect. Even the man didn't move. He couldn't. As she walked toward the exit, the quiet admiration followed her like a shadow. Passengers exchanged looks, nods, small acknowledgments that they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The man stayed behind, alone, collapsed into the seat that once symbolized his superiority. Now it symbolized nothing. The door opened. Dr. Monroe stepped into the tunnel, the night air brushing against her face. For her, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth, and truth had spoken louder than hate ever could.